I am also very happy because this is going to be slightly neuroscience heavy, and I've been told the audience doesn't have, like I said, quite diverse, and not a lot of people have a background in neuroscience. Please do stop me if there is a point at which I'm talking about something that doesn't make sense. All right, so I'm going to get started. I like to start with talking a little bit about my journey because just so you know where I come from and why I do what I do. So I started my education, university level education at the University of Delhi in India, where I did an undergraduate in biochemistry, so very molecular, genetics, that sort of thing. At the end of that, I just wasn't sure that I still loved the subject. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. And I got very involved in this very intense debating circuit that exists in the University of Delhi. And somehow from that, got convinced that perhaps communications was the right route for me. So I went and did an MBA or a Master's of Business at Mudras Communication, which is in the west of India, in Ahmedabad. And that then took me to work at L'Oreal in marketing for about 3 years. I hated my job, absolutely hated it. The only day I was happy was the 28th of the month because they paid me quite well. And that's the only reason I stuck around for a little bit. But by year 1.5, I knew I had to go back to science, but I knew it wasn't biochemistry, so there was a lot of thinking to do. So I spent some time doing that. And the metric I used was, do I enjoy reading about this subject? Because if you enjoy reading about it and endlessly don't mind going on about it, then that must be fit. So that's how I landed on neuroscience at the end of this journey. And I applied everywhere. And I moved then to the University of Bordeaux in France, where I did a master's of neuroscience and neuropharmacology. Again, this was kind of a mix of cognitive neuroscience and non-cognitive neuroscience. And between those subjects, what I was really interested in was synaptic plasticity and the influence of sort of things that are going around that, influence memory formation and things like that. So I did 2 master's internships because the master's of research. And I worked with mice and did something called in vivo patch clamp, where you actually record like single cells in alive mice. And while it was all fascinating and I really enjoyed it, it was not for me to have to kill one mouse every day. So I was like, okay, how can I then continue to study synaptic plasticity or like just brain plasticity, but in a different way? And the answer, and we're not torturing any children, was neuroimaging with like MRIs. So that then took me to do my PhD at the University of Melbourne, where I worked with Professor Sarah Whittle, who studies how parenting and other environmental factors influence brain development, and that in turn then influences mental health. So she's particularly interested in psychopathology as an outcome. So I spent about 4 years there and had a really great experience and that's where I kind of found my own niche because I was really interested in inequality, which is what I'll be talking to you about today. That then took me to work with Professor Katie McLaughlin at Harvard, who does very similar things to to Sarah, but a little bit more focused on inequality. And she also has a double PhD in epidemiology, as well as, like epidemiology, public health, as well as neuroscience. So this was the right mix for me because that's the kind of direction I wanted to go in. And then finally moved to King's for the position that I am at today, where I'm continuing this line of work. So the work that I'll be presenting today spans this entire last 3 steps of my trajectory from my PhD until now. And some work of my trainees as well. Okay, so preaching to the choir, but we know that the early environment is important for brain development, for cognitive outcomes, for mental health, and a lot of different things. And this has been known for over a century. And the early environment can be operationalized and thought about in many different ways, right? So you have parenting, the kind of schools children go to, physical abuse, verbal abuse, bullying, the kind of neighborhood they grow up in, so many different things. But I'm going to focus on socioeconomic status and inequality. And the reason for this is my upbringing in India. That's one of the reasons I came back into the field and do what I do, which is when you grow up in India, you see a lot of this intergenerational transmission of poverty, and finding ways to stop that from happening is essentially the motivation behind this research program. We can also think of these early environmental factors within the famous Bronfenbrenner biopsychosocial model, where you have the microsystem influencing children's development, which is more like the family, siblings, things like that. But then it goes all the way to the macro system. And I'm going to I just want to point you to this now, but I'm going to come back to this idea later in the presentation. You also have lots of other things in between, like the exosystem. So in between, sort of like local governments, neighborhoods, things like that. So now coming back to the original idea, which is childhood socioeconomic disadvantage is associated with worse outcomes. These can be poorer mental health across the lifespan, starting in adolescence, which is when mental health problems first begin to emerge, but also differences in cognitive function, which are evident as early as when kids are like 10 months old. So something like sustained attention, you can see as early as that. School readiness is extremely different, and then achievement throughout school. But what we don't know is the sort of mechanisms that transmit these effects. So what is it? What are the underlying pathways here? And we think that the brain might be one of those mechanisms because the brain is dynamically developing throughout childhood and adolescence. We're one of the few mammals to be born with only 25% of our brain volume. 25, that's it. It takes up to age 6 to even reach 90% of our adult brain volume. So there is so much time for the environment to influence the brain. And that's essentially why, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, this has happened. We're not developed because we're supposed to go through the first few years and adapt to our environments, right? So while this is happening, especially in the first 2 years, which is the most dynamic period of brain development, the environment can really get under the skin and get biologically embedded. So this is what we think and what kind of motivates this work. Now, on to what in the brain did we actually measure? So I'm just providing a little bit of MRI background very quickly. So hopefully you have some background for the upcoming findings. So we put kids in sometimes nice looking scanners like this. They're called mock scanners. So we can get them used to the noise, but this doesn't actually do any scanning. So we put them in, teach them how to not move. Then we put them in an actual scan because they move so much. Even adolescents, they move a lot. But kids under 8 are really hard. 3 and 4, impossible. So we put them in something like this, get them acclimatized, because it can also be quite a scary experience for a child to not understand what's it. It's a very narrow tunnel, very noisy. And that the whole thing often takes really long. So some of the studies, like 1.5 hours, depending on what exactly we're doing. Substantially shorter for children because obviously they can't. And we take them out and put them back in many times. And also sort of bribe and incentivize them with toys. So the two metrics that I'll be talking about today, the two sort of modalities, one is brain structure and another one is functional connectivity, and I'll come to that. But in brain structure, essentially, there are lots of things we can look at, but I'll be talking about gray matter structure today. And that specifically looks at things like the thickness of the cortex, the surface area of the cortex, and the volume of different regions. And this, essentially, you image them, then you put it through this amazing pre-processing and processing software, where it does these really cool things to expand the brain like into like a balloon using vertices all over, and then spits out values of these metrics, which is thickness, surface area, and volume. And that's what we use. And each of these like scans is basically like you see an image, but it's actually just numbers in the back end because it's how much signal are you getting. And the second metric is called functional connectivity. For this, we use a different type of MRI scan where we do functional MRI, where we measure the bold oxygenated response. So the important thing is, even when subjects are thinking of nothing in particular, the brain has what is called intrinsic activity. Even when you're sleeping, when your eyes are closed, you're doing no task at all, right? And regions of the brain that otherwise act in conjunction to perform tasks also tend to activate during rest. So it's kind of an idea like the frontal regions and parietal regions tend to activate together all the time when you're, making the decision to write something or thinking about something. Those connections get stronger and stronger. And even when you're not doing those activities, they are and remain connected and activate together at rest. So these regions are said to be functionally connected with one another. Now, just to illustrate what that means, so you can see basically what we're doing is imaging the brain many times over, let's say, 20 minutes. This is the activity levels across time for those 20 minutes. You can see that in activity A, like region A and region B, you have very similar activity, but this one seems to be sort of unrelated. It's not going up or going down in any specific pattern in a way that relates to the other regions. And what we do is basically calculate a simple Pearson correlation between these time series. And that's what we call functional connectivity. So how correlated is the time series of this region with this region? As is evident from here, these two we would call to be highly functionally connected, because actually I was lazy and put the exact same thing twice. And then these two would be low functional connectivity because they don't seem to be related to one another. Another thing to know about this is that we can look at connectivity at the region level. So one particular region of the brain, so let's say like the medial prefrontal cortex. But we can also look at networks. And networks, I'm going to go back to what I just said, which is multiple regions in the brain that co-activate together all the time. So we call them a network. Okay, so like frontoparietal network is one example. Okay, so now that you have that background, if you have any questions, please ask. But what I'll be presenting to you is studies investigating the role of socioeconomic status and inequality in shaping brain structure and connectivity during adolescence. So the first thing that I did was conduct a systematic review of the literature. And when I first started, I thought there might be 35 to 40 studies based on what I had seen, but there was a lot more in 2020, and this is 2021. So there has been a lot more since then as well. And I think we must have crossed 100 or 110. And using the systematic review, one thing that we noted was, of course, the thing that Sonali just mentioned, which is very few studies in young people, like below the age of, let's say, 7 or 8. Because again, they're hard to image, hard to recruit. But there were a couple of other things that were unknown that we then went on to address. So the first thing was there was very little work on neighborhoods. And this is something that I'll talk about a little bit more, but neighborhoods are, and especially during adolescence, become very important in children's development. SES is a term that was often used interchangeably as well. So people would refer to, let's say, neighborhood disadvantage, parent education, parent occupational prestige, parent income, and use all these terms sort of interchangeably as SES. And surely they don't all mean the same thing because they're not perfectly correlated. So that is another thing that we wanted to get, sort of dive into. And finally, the joint effects of different SES indicators. So I'm going to present work that kind of answers some of these questions partially. So first, the neighborhood domain. So neighborhood domain environments shape exposure to stressors and access to resources that we know influence mental health and cognitive function. And what's important is that these exist over and above individual level SES and other effects. So even if I control for child like adversity in the home, parenting, neighborhood level effects continue to remain sort of significant. And there's robust evidence showing that it actually associated with increased risk of psychosis, depression, many common mental health disorders, and worse cognitive function in young people. Just to illustrate something, like there's this amazing thing called the Opportunity Atlas for the United States. I don't think such a thing exists for the UK yet, so I use an American example, and also a lot of my data are American. But this is an illustration of exactly what I'm talking about. So this is Pittsburgh, United States. These two neighborhoods are separated by one street. So they're across the street from one another. And you can see the difference so the kids who grew up here had an average household income when they grew up of 22,000. And the kids who grew up here across the street had an average household income of 52,000. Just as an example, the incarceration rates are also wildly different. You have 1.2% here and 7.4% here. So the kind of neighborhood you grow up in goes on to have quite an important effect on long-term outcomes. And when I say lifespan in the lab website, that's sort of what I mean. Like I'm interested in what happens downstream many years later from things that happen and the brain development that happens in childhood and adolescence. So we examined then the effect of neighborhood disadvantage on brain structure and connectivity after accounting for these household level variables. In the first study, we looked at whether neighborhood disadvantage is associated with something called brain predicted age trajectory. And I'll explain what that is. So to examine brain predicted age, we have to do something called make a normative brain age model. And what do we do in that? We take structural MRI data, and that means the thickness, surface area, volume, the measures that I explained of all of these different regions in the brain. For this data set, we took those values. This is called the Philadelphia Neurodevelopmental Cohort. It's an American data set from Pennsylvania, and they're aged 8 to 21 years. And we take all that data for all of these people and we put it into a machine learning model. And we tell the machine learning model, hey, this is how old each person is. So the model has the opportunity to essentially learn this is what the brain of a typical 13-year-old looks like, right? And you give it the opportunity to learn that. And after that, you take that model and you put your own data in it. But you don't give the model your age, like not your age, your kid, like this participant's age. And then you ask the model, how old do you think this person is? So now that it has all of this information, it can spit out an age for each person, a predicted age. And we did this with Australian data. So there were 166 adolescents imaged 3 times, once at 12, once at 16, and once at 19. And we take that predicted age and we subtract that actual age from it. What that gives us is the brain age gap. So essentially, if that value is positive, then the model thought that you have a brain that is older than your actual age. And if that value is negative, then that means that you have sort of a younger brain. So one can sort of be accelerated development and the other one can be delayed development. So we took this variable, brain age gap, and we tried to see how neighborhood disadvantage predicts brain age gap over the entire course of adolescence from 12 to 19. And what we found was that disadvantage predicted a negative brain age gap trajectory. What that essentially means is that there was increased brain age at the start. So they had accelerated development at the start when they were 12, but that was no longer true by the time they turned 19 at the third time point. So this actually reflects slower change over time. So they would accelerate, so it's kind of non-linear. So they accelerate and then sort of stay the same. But the other kids, the ones that did not grow up in disadvantaged neighborhoods, kept moving at the same pace, let's say. And then we asked the question, and this is something I'm really interested in, which is what can moderate these effects? What can promote resilience in these contexts? So we asked whether temperament or positive parenting moderate associations between neighborhood disadvantage and brain age gap trajectory. And what we saw was that high effortful control, which is a sort of questionnaire-based assessment of inhibitory control, moderates these effects, and we see that it does. So you can see that in the low neighborhood disadvantage group, everybody kind of just hangs around 0. There's not any real kind of difference between them. But in the high neighborhood disadvantage group, you have everybody starting here at high brain age gap, but those with high effortful control, so the solid line here, have less negative slope over time. What that means is that they have less delay later on. So they kind of don't, they keep changing. It's not like they stop. Now, whether that's good or bad, hard to say, given we don't have that much data on them after these periods, but it's an interesting finding nonetheless. And we saw the same pattern with positive parenting. Again, you can see these 3 parallel lines. Doesn't really matter in the low neighborhood disadvantage group. But in the high neighborhood disadvantage group, you can see that the kids who receive these higher levels of positive parenting stay flat around 0, but the other kids don't. And in this study, we actually had parenting measured in a very nice way where we had them do tasks that were recorded live, and then coded second by second. So it's very sort of gold standard. How representative it is of day-to-day parenting, that's up for debate, but at least it was observed parenting behavior. In study 2, then we asked whether it was associated neighborhood disadvantage was associated with functional connectivity, because brain structure is very kind of doesn't change day to day. It's a more sort of, you can see cumulative effects of things over time, whereas functional connectivity is much more state-based. So if you've slept badly, your diet, but also cumulative effects, trait effects, like you can see a bunch of different things together in functional connectivity. And the interesting thing about functional connectivity versus structure is that functional connectivity is a much better predictor of mental health than structure is. But for cognition, they both predict cognition. So just something to be aware of. For this, used the adolescent brain cognitive development study data. At the time, we had data available for 7,600 kids. And we used a measure called area deprivation index, which is very similar to the IMD in the UK. So a kind of composite of many different neighborhood level variables. We examined the effects of this indicator on functional connectivity between networks. And remember, networks are groups of regions that do similar functions. and then examined whether positive parenting and school environments can moderate these effects. And I don't want you to focus on the figure too much, but what was sort of surprising here was that there were widespread effects on functional connectivity. Each of these things is a network. So, for example, this is the auditory network, this is the frontoparietal network, which I just told you about, or the default mode network, which is kind of introspective processes. And these values reflect T statistic values. So if they're negative, higher disadvantage associated with lower connectivity. If they're positive, higher disadvantage associated with higher connectivity. And what was interesting is that I have whited out all of the non-significant associations in the bottom half of this triangle. So it was associated with about 50 to 55% of the connections. Now, this is what was surprising, the sort of widespread effects. These were regions involved in goal setting, planning, self-reflection, so higher order cognitive processes, but also sensory, motor, and language functioning. And the reason this was important was because for a long time, SES research, neighborhood research, because of the effects that we see on cognition, on academic achievement, has sort of focused on frontal regions and language regions, temporal regions. And if such effects were found with sensory and motor regions, they were either put in the supplement, not really interpreted, and they weren't considered very important. But what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years is there's been a change in that, where we see lots of adversity and disadvantage effects in these regions. And obviously they're bound to be meaningful because the brain doesn't work in isolation with like one region doing one function. It's everything is sort of acting together. And what we're seeing again and again is that effects are quite global. So interpreting any one specific region or network isn't particularly beneficial. It's thinking about like the brain as a large scale network, you know? And then we asked the question that I just told you about, which is, do positive home and school environments moderate these effects? It's not all bleak because they can. We see that they have some sort of buffering effects on the associations between disadvantage and functional connectivity. And I'm just going to show you one illustration of the effect. You have neighborhood disadvantage on the x-axis, higher disadvantage here, lower disadvantage here. The slope for the association between connectivity and disadvantage is less negative in the context of higher parental acceptance. And this was also the case for school environments, but I won't bother you with all of the figures. Remember that this is a very large scale study of about 12,000 kids. So everything is, we have lots of breadth and not that much depth. So school environment was measured using 5 or 6 items, which basically ask the kids, do you receive positive feedback when you do a good job? Do you have good relationships with your teachers? Do you have availability of extracurricular activities? And do you feel safe at school? And parenting was, do your parents smile at you? Do they tell you that they love you? Do they show you warmth and support when you feel distressed? So that was about 5 or 6 items. So each of these things was measured using very quick questionnaires. The second, I guess I didn't include those slides, but these networks and connections that we see here were relevant for cognitive function among these kids in the expected direction. So if this is negative, then negative connectivity is worse for lower connectivity is worse for cognitive function. So everything was in the direction that you expected. So 50% of these were then associated eventually with both mental health and cognitive function. And we use like a multivariate approach for this. If you have questions about this, I can talk to you after that. Okay. In the next next couple of studies, we then wanted to tease these effects apart a little bit further. Because while these indicators have sort of been used interchangeably, they don't all mean the same thing. Of course, they're overlapping, but they're also partially distinct. So the correlation between income and education tends to be around 0.6 or 0.65. And the association between neighborhood disadvantage and income and education is actually only 0.4. Even lower in the UK, 0.3, 0.35 in like Scotland and like in London. So obviously they're capturing something different. So what can income mean? So we have quality of healthcare, especially in the United States. Here, of course, less applicable because of the NHS. Availability of toys and books in the home, quality of childcare that you can afford, as well as parental stress because of financial strain. Just a couple of things. Education. So over and above income, you can still provide cognitive stimulation in other ways that do not require material things, like reading stories before bed or telling stories before bed, semantic and linguistic complexity, as well as providing parental monitoring and supervision, setting rules at home, things like that. And finally, neighborhoods can, over and above these effects, be associated with exposure to noise. You could live close to a railway line, which can disrupt sleep, for example. Crime in the area can increase stress levels, as well as peer influences. As adolescents get older, they spend more and more time autonomously in the neighborhood. And finally, pollution and toxicants, because a lot of places, disadvantaged areas are close to either currently industrial areas or in areas that used to be industrial. So because of this, we think that they could have unique associations with brain structure and connectivity. So we examined the sort of independent effects of putting all of these indicators in the same model. This was also with the ABCD study. We had area deprivation index, which I've just told you about, educational attainment in years, and income to needs ratio, which is basically income adjusted for your household size. Because as you can imagine, living on 50,000 for one person is very different from living on 50,000 for four people. So we adjust that as well. We included them in the model simultaneously, and we did something called within sample split half replication. Basically, split the sample in half and did this many times randomly to check for the robustness of findings. So what we found was exactly sort of what we expected, which is that effects, so you don't need to look at this in great detail, but what it's showing us is that some effects are common and some effects are not. So we have partially overlapping, but some distinct effects. And that's exactly what we would expect for things that with that level of correlation. But what was most interesting, and this is the running theme, is that sensory motor systems were just as involved as higher order cognitive, sort of frontoparietal, central executive, those sort of networks. Same thing for brain structure. We actually found that all three SES measures were positively associated with total volume of the brain, total surface area, as well as the average cortical thickness across the brain. Where we see higher advantage is higher thickness, area, and volume, as well as some unique regional associations. So you can see here that neighborhood disadvantage is associated with thickness of these sensory and motor regions, but also parietal as well as frontal, and that's occipital, so visual. So again, kind of across the board. And in this study, then we want to see the joint effects. We were like, okay, now we know about positive parenting, we know a little bit more about temperamental effortful control, but can high SES in one domain buffer the effects of low SES in another? So if you live in a disadvantaged neighborhood, can having higher income or higher parental educational attainment kind of protect against living in a disadvantaged neighborhood, just as an example? And we saw that it can, but it was exclusively for income. So income buffers the effects of ADI, as you can see here again. Line is flat for people who come from higher income backgrounds. So there is a protective effect of income on the effects of neighborhood disadvantage, on connectivity, and the same thing on structure. So I'm just showing again a snapshot of the figures, not all of the figures. So again, educational attainment here, ADI here, and the line for higher income is the one when you look at like simple slopes and things is not significant, whereas you have very different like steep slopes at lower levels of income. So the sort of conclusion was that higher income can protect against the effects of low SES in two other domains, which is educational attainment and neighborhood disadvantage. And in this one, we actually examined associations with academic outcomes. So now we looked at connectivity development over time. So everything so far, except the brain age model, so the last two studies and the functional connectivity one were cross-sectional. And then we wanted, this might be a cumulative effect of childhood SES, something that we've seen throughout childhood and adolescence. Let's see if it continues to influence development during adolescence. And that's what we did here. And we also examined consequences for academic outcomes. So ABCD study has self-reported and parent-reported grades, which in the US, I found out after doing these studies means a lot less than we would think. They're only correlated at 0.35 with total cognitive scores. So it also captures a lot of like parents going to school, highly educated parents going to school, helping with grade inflation, like talking to teachers, tutoring, a lot of things that don't actually reflect cognition, but still grades, decide which college you get into, so they still matter. Right. So we examined associations between those same indicators and functional connectivity development over time. And we only this time focused on something called within network connectivity. And this actually reflects sort of increasing efficiency in the brain. So if regions that only the regions that need to talk to each other should talk to each other. Like we shouldn't, like if every neuron was communicating with every neuron in the brain, there would be way too much noise and it would be a waste of energetic resources. So as we develop, as we grow older, the brain becomes more and more efficient in that in its communication. So that's what we sort of capture within network connectivity. So regions that do similar functions should speak more and more with one another. And we didn't see a specific consistent pattern, but all three SES indicators were associated with development over time. It varied depending on the pair of networks we were looking at. But what was most interesting, because you don't need to focus on this, just know that it exists, is that we did have mediation effects. So parental educational attainment influenced sensory motor connectivity over time, which then mediated effects with school grades. So essentially, this was associated with less change over time, and less change over time was associated with better grades. So it's a higher educational attainment, change in connectivity good for grades. We did actually have other networks implicated, but I don't want to get into it because we ran the models in a few different ways where we only included one SES indicator at a time, but also all three. The finding I'm showing you is when all three are included. So this is over and above income and ADI effects. So how do we interpret that? So sensory and motor regions are increasingly recognized as relevant for neurocognitive development. We know, in fact, that parental educational attainment relates strongly to motor skill development when kids are very young. So fine motor skills and gross motor skills in the early years. And then motor skills are closely linked to academic achievement and school readiness, especially reading and math. And higher SES environments where parents are more educated probably provide more opportunities that support that motor development. So not just giving toys, but doing the right thing, like telling children to pick something up, not intervening at the wrong time, giving them developmentally appropriate materials. That is something that's actually very important. And I guess what we're seeing is those effects span out in adolescence. So the effects of parental education on motor development and academic outcomes persist into adolescence. And what are the pathways here for these effects that we're seeing of SES on the brain? We have a couple of review papers on this. So we have one on environmental contributions to cognitive development with a focus on cognitive stimulation, which we think is a very sort of crucial pathway through which this occurs. But in this systematic review of 138 studies, we did find that you have stimulation being the most sort of consistently implicated pathway. And then saw other things like parental educational expectations was something that popped out quite a bit as well. We saw stress, slightly less so for academic achievement, but I imagine that it's a lot stronger for mental health effects. Yeah, so a few different things. We had stress, stimulation. What was the third one? So we support, parental support for like academic learning and things like that. A second pathway that we've investigated is based on something called life history theory. So life history theory is an anthropological, like an evolutionary psychology theory, which suggests that in environments of chronic stress, you would have sort of subconscious, like it's not a decision that anybody makes is what I'm trying to say. Chronic stress accelerates biological development in case of potential mortality. So basically the idea is development gets accelerated so that you can reproduce before you die, because there's resource allocation trade-offs in environments where survival is questionable, essentially, right? And there's a lot of evidence actually showing this from non-neuroscience literature, where we see molars actually pop out earlier. And this was an accidental finding when people looking at MRI scans before they did the skull stripping and everything, like before removing the skull and looking at just the brain. They saw teeth pop out earlier. They've seen puberty being accelerated. So girls have early menarche when they experience trauma, for example. So based on this model, we thought maybe puberty, because puberty is such an important transition in adolescence, and you have sex hormones that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and we know are tightly linked with brain development. So we examined puberty as a pathway. And this work was led by Dimitris, who's doing a part-time postdoc with me. And we did find, actually, that, let me just tell you what we did first. So we examined pubertal status at baseline as well as tempo, so the rate of change. And the idea is essentially that if you live in a stressful environment, you should be entering puberty sooner and going through puberty faster. So you have early onset and faster tempo. And what we found was that in females, low income, which reflects resource scarcity, was associated with earlier pubertal timing and altered pubertal tempo. These effects predicted cortical thinning at global and regional levels. And then all of these pathways in a sequential mediation model using structural equation modeling and latent growth models predicted internalizing symptoms or emotional symptoms. So puberty was one of those pathways. So we've talked about like cognitive simulation being one of them, but also obviously the resource scarcity and stress of these environments influences other biological pathways. Okay, so earlier pubertal onset and therefore earlier exposure to sex hormones predicts faster brain development. Now, on to something slightly different to what I've been talking about so far. Of course, we can look at SCS effects in a lot of different data sets, but what's unique about ABCD is that it allows analyses that require geographical spread, because I can't do the same sort of analysis. If I collected data just in London or just in Boston, in and around the universities that I was at, it's a lot harder to get diversity in some things. Like, for example, neighborhoods differ in level of toxicants and green spaces. So if I was interested in that, I would have to look much wider than recruit just around one university. And this is something that's obviously hard to do as an individual. And that's why ABCD comes in, and it's great because it's 21 sites across 17 states in the United States. And those states are quite different from one another. And we looked at the effects of green spaces because we saw so many neighborhood effects. We were interested in like, okay, what is it actually about neighborhoods other than, people around you being a certain level of education, the kind of schools that you go to, because they're on the basis of the taxes the residents pay in the US. There must be a few other things that people have not examined. And one of those things were green spaces. So you can see that the US varies wildly in like how much green space they have access to. But just to point out, I was here. And if I was simply recruiting here, that's all dark green, right? So to capture some of this yellow, I need to go to Utah, California, and all of that. So this work was led by my student, Qing Yang, who's now doing a PhD in Shanghai. And she basically examined whether she showed that green space exposure is linked to better mental health and academic outcomes, but that's something that's been examined through systematic reviews and stuff. And then we tested whether brain structural development helps explain these associations. So we had 7,000 kids, temporally separated data, and then we used structural equation modeling to do to test mediation. And interestingly, over and above household and neighborhood disadvantage, we had access to green spaces being associated with widespread patterns of brain development, brain structure and structural development over time. But just to give you some context, I'm not sure if people know, but it's used, like we use satellite data to be able to extract green spaces. So it's like Google Earth and things like that. Over time, higher green space was associated with greater growth, less cortical thinning, altered growth trajectories in general, and these mediated links with mental health and academic outcomes. So both academic self-reported grades as well as internalizing, externalizing, and attention symptoms. So emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms, and attention symptoms. But now we're looking at pollution. So stay tuned. I don't have final results yet, but we're finding similar stuff, and we're also seeing that it interacts with genetic risk. So those who are at genetic risk for psychopathology are more sensitive to the effects of pollution, which we would probably find for a lot of things. And finally, inequality. Now, inequality at a macroeconomic scale, not inequality at the household or the neighborhood level, is also something you can only examine with something like ABCD. So we know now, for ages again, children are susceptible to their environments, and there's lots of research on proximal influences. But the macroeconomic context matters too. And this has, of course, been pointed out as early as the 1970s and probably even before that. And in this context, inequality is particularly important. But what is income inequality and how is it different from what I've been talking about so far? It's a slightly more abstract concept because it isn't about the resources you personally have, right? It is a property of societies. It's structural. High income inequality essentially means that there's disproportionate amount of wealth being held in a very small percentage of the population. So we have one common indicator that is used quite widely. There are many others, but one called the Gini coefficient. And it's calculated with something called the Lorenz curve. We don't do that. The census data does that because we don't have access to that. But what you do need to know about it, and all you need to know about it, is that it ranges from a value of 0 to 1. So 0 is perfect equality, where all of us would earn exactly the same amount of money. But a value of 1 would mean that one person would have all of the income and everybody else would have 0. Obviously, neither of these extremes exists in the world. Most countries, most states lie somewhere in between these two extremes. So why is income inequality relevant? For this, I will point you to this book by this economist and epidemiologist at University of York, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. They've done fantastic work over decades showing the effects of inequality on outcomes across the lifespan. So children's grades and all of that are just one of them, but there's mental health, there's obesity, there's like child mortality, like you name it and it's probably in the book. So, and it's also just a very good read, so I would recommend it. So because of these effects that we see on mental health, we were interested in whether macroeconomic inequality can have similar measurable effects on the brain as individual level poverty, right? Because again, something abstract. So we don't really know whether this is something that happens. So we used ABCD data, 17 states. And the exposure here was state level income inequality. So Gini coefficient at the state level. And we examined associations between inequality, brain structure, connectivity, and mental health. And what's important is we adjusted for a lot of different things we thought could account for these effects. So we have income, education, parent mental health issues, because that can influence parenting quality, state level incarceration rate, that can influence how safe people feel, chronic stress, Medicaid expansion status, because whether or not you have health care matters a lot in the US, as well as temporary assistance for needy families. That's a welfare scheme in the US, which varies state by state. Like states differ a lot in how generous they are in their social security, social safety net. And then we examine the role of brain and associations with mental health outcomes. So again, just to give you a map of the US, obviously everybody who lives in one state will have the same value, right? But the good thing about the US is, states vary a lot. And the good thing about ABCD is that it has data from a state like New York, which is the most unequal, or California, also very unequal, to Utah, which is the most equal state in the US. So having that kind of range was nice to be able to capture the entire range in the country. And we found similar effects. So over and above all of those confounders that I just mentioned to you, we did find that higher inequality was associated with lower thickness, lower surface area, and lower volume. So, I mean, of course, the effect sizes are small, but effect sizes are practically always small at population level, but mean a lot in the long term, right? And effects were widespread at the regional level as well at the level of functional connectivity. And they mediated effects with total mental health problems 18 months later. So we can then say that these changes that are happening in the brain have some sort of relevance for outcomes. So we could basically conclude it from this that inequality is a societal level determinant of brain and behavior and needs to be tackled alongside poverty. And we proposed a few different mechanisms for this in a different conceptual paper, which basically, because it's hard to know exactly what is going on. Nobody has really tested it. But the idea that some people, including us, have had is that it changes the social fabric and social environment that you live in if it's more unequal. So status hierarchies become far more salient when you live in a more unequal place. So for example, more unequal countries like the US and the UK, actually, when people post stuff online, they'll talk about luxury brands more, like Chanel or Dior. And more equal places like Sweden and Finland, they're happy to tweet about Aldi. And these are like analyses that have been done with large-scale Twitter data based on the IP addresses and things like that. Conspicuous consumption, so buying really high, whatever they call luxury cars, is more common in more unequal states. So there's this idea of like keeping up with the Joneses. You're constantly thinking about where on that sort of ladder you lie and trying to prove it all the time. And this creates something called status anxiety. And this can then become a stressor. In adolescence, this can manifest as like comparison with your peers at school, like what brands are other kids wearing, or like, because they don't have uniforms. So things like that. And the second mechanism is lower social capital. So in more unequal places, one, tax collection at the high end is a lot lower, which means there's less money to spend on public infrastructure, but also less willingness to spend on public infrastructure. There's also lower trust in societies and lower social skills, so more loneliness, people are more separated from one another, neighbors barely know each other, that sort of thing. So lower social capital and higher status anxiety are some of the mechanisms we think are at play here. Why is it relevant today? So this is income inequality in 2021. The top 10% get 52% of the income, and the bottom 50% only get 88.5% of the income. And when we talk about wealth, it gets even worse. So the top 10% have 76% of the wealth globally, and the bottom 50% have less than 2%. So, it's wild, and it seems to only be getting worse. You can see the trends since the 1970s and 80s when sort of neoliberal policies came into play. Things have been getting worse globally, global south as well as north, but also even more egalitarian societies in Europe are experiencing this. As an illustration, that is the wealth of the richest 50 families in the UK. It is also the combined wealth of half of the UK population. So it is, quite dire. But I wanted to end on a slightly more positive note. So we examined cognitive resilience and no brain imaging in this study. So not all children who live in more unequal places or grow up in more disadvantaged backgrounds have lower cognitive function, right? So we have about 25 to 30%, I would say 20 to 30% on average, that do not have that. Characterizing the factors that promote that kind of resilience is of crucial importance, because where does that come in? What is it about their environment? So what is it about them that allows them to flourish regardless? So what we did was we took kids from the bottom tertile of income to needs in the same data set, and we classified them into two groups. One was above average cognitive function, and we call them cognitively resilient, and below average cognitive function, or vulnerable, or BAS. That's what we call them in the study. And we wanted to know what predicts the membership of this group. Just to give you an idea of the data set, you can see that about 30% here and another 25 to 30% fall in the resilient category. And we examined fluid cognition, crystallized cognition separately, because they are quite different from each other in the sense that fluid cognition is more kind of abstract reasoning, a little bit more innate and less modifiable. Crystallized cognition is more about acquired knowledge over time. So things that you learn in school, like reading ability, verbal comprehension, that sort of falls into crystallized cognition. And you can see that they obviously differ a lot in their scores. So you have like an average of 105 versus 93, or 119 versus 89. So the two groups differ a lot, but not that much in income to needs. So we took many different aspects of their life and developmental history and their neighborhood. So I think it was something like 165, 170 different variables. And we put them into different machine learning models. And we tried to see what predicts membership in the cognitively resilient group after accounting for all of these other things, right? So we did like a bunch of different things and eventually got output from logistic regressions to see effect sizes. These are some of the variables. I think you can't read it because of the screen being a bit smaller, but we had a bunch of different variables that predicted resilience in both domains, fluid cognition and crystallized cognition. So some things were, for example, being older. So simply just being older, you were more likely to be classified. It doesn't mean you're cognitively resilient. It's just that your cognitive function is higher. At that age, 10-year-olds are different from 9-year-olds. So the model picked up on that. Income itself actually here. So even within this bottom tertile, having slightly higher income, you're already bound to have higher cognitive function. So we adjusted for that as well. But a bunch of other things like Physical activity, participation in performing arts. So if you participate in performing arts or engage more in physical activity, you're more likely to be cognitively resilient. We have breastfeeding. So higher duration of breastfeeding was associated with cognitive resilience. Birth weight, so not being low birth weight was associated with cognitive resilience. Your parents' educational attainment, both primary and secondary, and a couple of other neighborhood level things like neighborhood public assistance rate. So the number of people in your neighborhood that receive public assistance being lower was associated with resilience. So these were things that were predicting resilience on both fluid and crystallized. But as I said, crystallized a little bit more environmentally determined. When we went one step further and separated which one predicts only fluid, only crystallized, we saw a lot fewer for fluid. So not being advanced in your pubertal development, so being a little bit delayed, was actually predictive of fluid cognitive resilience, which was interesting. Neighborhood poverty rate, neighborhood housing vacancy rate, and lax parental rules. So parents having some rules on substances. And then you have a lot more for crystallized cognitive function. So we see a couple of temperamental things, pro-social behavior, some weird stuff like your parent having attention problems and getting help for it was associated with resilience. But I don't think that's actually a predictive resilience. It'd be like capturing something else, which is the kind of parent that acknowledges that they have problems and goes and gets help for it is a different kind of parent. And that might be what we're seeing here. And then lower levels of family conflict. Again, a bunch of neighborhood things, as well as school environment. So now just to conclude, cumulatively, we've shown that inequality at the household, neighborhood, and macroeconomic level is associated with deviations from typical brain developmental trajectories, as well as cross-sectional associations with brain structure and function. And we've shown the role of individual, family, and broader factors in promoting that resilience, in promoting resilience in those contexts. And just to mention a couple of other things that we've done or are planning to do, in case anyone's interested, we have work on childhood maltreatment and brain development. So abuse and neglect and measured using things like, retrospective or prospective childhood trauma questionnaire, that sort of thing, as well as one study on the school environment. And we're now really interested in causal relationships and mechanisms. So we're actually using MCS data or Millennium Cohort Study data to examine changes in poverty and how that relates to outcomes at age 17 and hopefully age 23 when the new wave of the study comes out. But yeah, we want to use like G estimation, marginal structural models that actually allow to model intervention effects instead of simply correlations between things. And we're really interested in the pace of brain development. So this is what the NERG is funding, where instead of just looking at brain development at a point in time, we think that development isn't accelerated or delayed, but rather just simply different. And it's going to be, and that pace at which it develops throughout childhood and adolescence is going to predict cognitive function later on. And this is based on like computational neuroscience models for circuit refinement. But we're going to use HPCD data, which is, I don't know if people here have heard of it, but it's called the Healthy Brain Cognitive Development Study, which has now started. And it's going to do imaging many times from when kids are 0 to 5 for 7,500 families. And they recruited the mothers when they were pregnant. And hopefully they'll have very good SES distribution because the hook for this study and this grant in the US, again, multi-site, was opioid exposure. So they're going to specifically recruit half the sample with that in mind of mothers who've consumed opioids either before or during pregnancy. So that's going to be a very rich data set to be able to examine these things. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.